The year 1894 would be remembered in whispers and in wails, in sermons laced with sorrow, and in the guttural cries of men who saw the end before it arrived. It was not merely a year marked by calamity, nor just another passage in the ledger of war. It was an epochal fracture, a breaking of the world's spine. Faith had always been a weapon in Trench Crusade, wielded with the weight of eternity. But faith was also a structure, an iron lattice binding millions together, suspending them above the abyss. In 1894, that lattice shattered. 3 figures, each an axis upon which Christendom turned, fell within days of each other, their lives snuffed out with an orchestrated precision that could only be the work of something greater, something darker. The Supreme Pontiff, His Holiness upon the throne of St. Peter, found his final moment in the bloodied embrace of a silent assassin. The Holy Roman Emperor, the last great shield of Europa, was torn from his earthly throne and left to bleed out in his own halls. And the prophetess Aelia, the voice of the Redeemer, perished mid-sermon, her words turning into a death rattle as her congregation screamed. It was an execution of the divine order itself, a coordinated immolation of the very idea that the faithful had a center, a foundation, a guiding hand. And then, before the blood had even dried upon the marble of the cathedrals, the heretic legions struck. The war had always ebbed and flowed, but what followed was not war. It was annihilation, carried out with the cold, mechanical precision of devils and men who had sold their souls for just such an opportunity. In the Levant and in Europe alike, the hammer fell. The nobles of Hell's Seventh Circle led the charge, their ranks swollen with machines of war and creatures wrenched from the bowels of perdition itself. No man's land became a butcher's pit, and the walls of once holy cities blackened under ceaseless bombardment. Panic gripped the faithful. Armies that had stood for centuries, bound together by the steel will of their leaders, found themselves rudderless. The church fractured, its generals at one another's throats, each declaring themselves the rightful inheritor of the Supreme Pontiff's command. The Holy Roman Empire was left a headless beast, its provinces turning upon each other, each vying for dominion in the chaos. And the followers of the prophetess? They were left to wander, their faith battered but not yet broken, their prayers turning desperate. The heretics knew no hesitation. Theirs was a war of certainty, and they capitalized upon the faithful's confusion with ruthless efficiency. In less than a year, entire front lines had collapsed. The ruins of ancient Antioch trembled under the weight of hellfire. The fields of Germania, once the last bastion of unbroken imperial might, became graveyards for thousands of knights and soldiers who had nothing left but their swords and their prayers. Even Britannia, isolated and fortified beyond measure, braced itself, for it was no longer an island of safety, but a fortress awaiting siege. The war was not new. The trenches had existed for centuries, carved into the flesh of the world like open wounds. But 1894 was the beginning of something else. It was the moment when those who fought did so not to reclaim what had been lost, but to simply delay the inevitable. It was the year of the Broken Trinity. The air of Rome was one of sorrow, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica tolling a funeral mass before the body had even cooled. The Supreme Pontiff lay sprawled across the marble floor of the Sistine Chapel, his white robes soaked through with blood, a crimson stain spreading outward like the petals of a flower in bloom. The holiest man in Christendom, the voice of God on earth, had been silenced by a single blade. There had been no forewarning, no great sign of the heavens splitting open to herald disaster. The assassin had moved like a shadow, slipping past guards, past holy men deep in prayer, past walls that had withstood centuries of siege. Some say he wore the garb of a simple penitent, his face shrouded beneath a pilgrim's hood, his steps silent upon the sacred stones. Others swear he was no man at all, but a thing conjured from the depths of hell, an agent of damnation sent to unmake the very heart of the faith. Regardless of the truth, the result was undeniable. The Supreme Pontiff's throat had been cut with a razor's precision, and with him, the stability of the Holy See had been gutted. Chaos and anarchy did not wait, because there is no such thing as a power vacuum. Before the body had been lifted from the ground, the cardinals were already at war with one another, their voices rising in discord beneath the painted ceiling of Michelangelo's Last Judgment. The conclave that should have begun in mourning and solemn prayer became an open battlefield of politics and desperation. Some called for immediate retaliation, declaring that the only answer to such an atrocity was war, total and unrelenting. Others whispered of caution, of securing their own domains before the heretic legions struck further. And then there were those who saw opportunity. For centuries, the office of the Supreme Pontiff had been more than a spiritual title. It had been a throne of power, of dominion over armies, of control over the great tides of war. Now, with that throne empty, the knives of ambition flashed in the dark. Assassins stalked the halls of the Vatican. Bishops who had once been allies turned on one another, their private guards engaging in quiet skirmishes beneath candlelit chambers. Deals were brokered in blood and betrayal, each faction vying to place their own candidate upon the papal seat before it could be claimed by another. All the while, the faithful, the nameless millions who had fought and bled in the trenches of this eternal war, waited for a new shepherd to guide them. They prayed in streets still damp with the blood of their Holy Father, their voices a chorus of grief that stretched from the alleyways of Rome to the ruins of Antioch. But no answer came. The church, the unwavering bastion of their faith, was splintering before their eyes. The heretics did not wait. While Rome burned with its own internal strife, the legions of hell mustered. From the depths of their infernal fortresses, from the blasphemous cathedrals of the damned, they prepared to strike. Their generals had waited for this moment, for the day when the church would be too consumed with its own infighting to see the dagger aimed at its throat. And when they struck, it was not with a single blade, but with a storm of fire and steel. The faithful had lost their pope. Soon they would lose much more. As dire news were heard, the emperor had fallen. The Holy Roman Emperor did not fall in fire and fury, as legends might have foretold, but as all things great and ancient do, undone by treachery, swallowed by silence, his name already fading before his body had grown cold. His court had been a fortress of tradition, an unbroken lineage of steel and sanctity stretching back across centuries, binding the faithful to an authority older than many of the walls they fought to defend. He had been more than a ruler. He was a symbol, a warlord in a gilded helm, the last great monarch to stand against the abyss. And yet, as with all symbols, he was not immune to death. On the night of his assassination, the imperial palace was quiet. The war had raged for centuries beyond its walls, but within there remained a sense of unyielding permanence. The stained glass of the great cathedral still cast its holy light upon the throne. The banners of the realm, emblazoned with the sigil of the cross, still hung above the marble floors. The emperor's guard still patrolled the halls, their armor polished, their swords sharp. None of it mattered. The death commandos moved as wraiths through the corridors, slipping past guards with a silence unnatural for men. But then, perhaps they were no longer men at all. To be trained in the seventh circle of hell was to be reforged in the blackest crucibles, to have every human frailty burned away. The assassins that came for the emperor had no names, no voices, and no hesitation. The first fell upon his chamberlain as he made his nightly rounds, severing his throat before he could scream. The second dispatched the guards with quiet efficiency, their bodies crumpling like broken dolls upon the stone floor. And the last moved directly for the emperor himself, stepping through the candlelight with a dagger wreathed in unholy scripture, its runes writhing with damnation. It is said that the emperor did not rise in panic. There were no cries for help, no frantic attempts at escape. The ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, whose armies had waged war against the heretics for centuries, simply stood. He met the assassin's gaze with the weight of history behind his eyes, and in that moment, one might have believed that even the damned hesitated before striking down such a man. But hesitation, if it existed, was fleeting. The blade found its home in his chest, splitting through armor and cloth alike, carving deep into flesh. Blood soaked into the imperial robes, the golden embroidery drinking it greedily. The emperor collapsed to his knees, hands trembling as they clutched at the wound. His breath was shallow, his vision darkening, but still, his lips moved. Not in agony, not in a plea for mercy, but in a whisper. Words only the assassin could hear before the darkness claimed him. The death commando lingered only for a second longer than necessary, watching as the last great ruler of Christendom slumped forward, the weight of his crown too great to hold aloft in death. And then, like a phantom, he was gone. Dawn broke over an empire without its sovereign. The news spread like wildfire. The streets of Vienna, once filled with the thunderous marches of imperial legions, were now consumed with riots and grief. The noble houses, long kept in check by the emperor's hand, turned upon one another like starved wolves, each vying for control of a throne left empty. The armies that had stood united beneath the imperial banner hesitated for the first time in centuries. Without their liege, without the voice that had commanded them across generations, their purpose seemed unsteady. The heretics did not wait. With the emperor's blood still staining the marble halls of his palace, the seventh circle of hell's forces surged forward. They struck at the borders of the empire, tearing into its defenses with a brutality that could only be measured in massacres. Cities that had withstood sieges for generations fell in mere weeks. Outposts that had once repelled the armies of the damned crumbled under their own discord. The Holy Roman Empire was not merely without its emperor, it was without direction, without unity. And the heretics would carve through it like a blade through dying flesh. As the empire bled, its borders collapsing beneath the tide of heretic hordes, the last remnants of order clung to faith like drowning men to drifting wood. In the absence of emperors and kings, it was not steel nor strategy that held the line, it was belief. And in this twilight of Christendom, all eyes turned to the one voice that had not yet faltered, the one beacon that had not yet been snuffed out. She stood upon the pulpit, bathed in the golden light of a setting sun, her voice rising over the gathered faithful like the tolling of a great bell. Prophetess Aelia, the voice of the Redeemer, the hand that guided, the last light of the church. She spoke, and the world listened. Her sermons had carried armies into battle, had held broken men together when even faith had begun to fracture. Where warlords and generals wielded steel and fire, Aelia wielded words, and her words had been enough to hold Christendom upright in its most desperate hours. But faith does not shield against knives. In the vast cathedral of ancient Antioch, thousands had gathered to hear her speak. Pilgrims knelt in the aisles, soldiers leaned upon their rifles, their helmets resting at their feet. The air was thick with the scent of incense, of sweat, of desperation. They had come not for empty promises, not for the hollow reassurances of lesser men. They had come to be given purpose. For the Supreme Pontiff was dead. The Holy Roman Emperor was slain. The great pillars of the world had crumbled in fire and blood, and now all eyes turned to Aelia. She spoke of endurance, of suffering, yes, but also of triumph. She told them that though the world had darkened, though the enemy struck from the shadows like vermin gnawing at the foundations of the righteous, the light of the Redeemer would not falter. She spoke of the trials ahead, of the heretic warbands mustering in the east, of the hellish machines being readied in the pits of Inferno, of the noble houses of Christendom falling to infighting even as the darkness surged forward. And still, she spoke of hope. It was said that when Aelia preached, even the most hardened warriors found their hands shaking. Even the most faithless were forced to listen. Even the damned themselves turned their heads, if only for a moment, as if some buried ember within them flickered back to life. That ember was snuffed before it could burn. The shot rang out like the crack of a breaking world. Aelia's voice faltered, her lips parting not in speech but in a sharp, stunned breath. A bloom of crimson spread across the front of her robe, deep and dark, as if the very fabric of her vestments had been wounded. There was no time for cries of horror, no time for the faithful to react. A second shot struck her as she staggered, the force of it hurling her back against the altar, shattering the sacred relics that had stood there for centuries. Her fingers clutched at her chest, a trembling hand reaching upward, as though trying to grasp something unseen, something beyond the veil of this world. She did not fall immediately. Even as blood filled her lungs, even as the strength drained from her body, Aelia forced herself upright. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, scanned the crowd, as if memorizing every face, as if etching this moment into something eternal. Her lips moved once more, forming words that no one would ever hear, for her voice had left her. And then, at last, she fell. For a moment there was silence. Then the cathedral erupted. Screams of rage, of grief, of madness. Soldiers raised their weapons, eyes burning with vengeance, but there was no enemy to be seen. The assassin had vanished as quickly as they had struck, their work complete, their purpose fulfilled. The prophetess was dead. The one voice that had kept the fractured remnants of Christendom from collapse had been silenced. Outside the cathedral, the war drums of the heretic legions had already begun to sound. The faithful, for the first time in centuries, had no one left to guide them. The first shells fell upon Antioch before the bells had finished tolling for Aelia. For centuries, the city had stood as the last bulwark against damnation, the threshold between Christendom and the abyss. Its walls were thick with the prayers of the faithful, its streets paved with the bones of the martyrs who had died defending it. Even as the trenches of the world deepened, even as the lines of war shifted back and forth like the tide, New Antioch had endured. But nothing endures forever.